June 17, 1959, 08:15, Thule Air Base, Greenland, Kingdom of Denmark. The Arctic wind cut through the fabric of the early morning like metal on ice. At the heart of the frozen expanse, a handful of U.S. Army engineers stumbled out of their sleeping tents, boots crunching against the grinding frost. They were part of a small, outwardly innocuous camp at first glance, but beneath their measured movements, an extraordinary secret pulsed like a buried heartbeat. Here, beneath the vast Greenland ice sheet, the United States was quietly attempting something historic and perilous. Few outside the inner circles of the Pentagon knew it yet, but moments like this would mark the beginning of an audacious plan that could reshape the very notion of Arctic warfare. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had already signed the orders months before, approving a covert project so bold that not a single Danish official had been informed. Greenland, though officially part of the Kingdom of Denmark, was treated as a strategic chess piece in the escalating tensions of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's long-range bomber threat was a shadow in every Pentagon briefing, every NATO strategy session. Planners believed that to deter an attack, or to strike first if necessary, the United States needed a presence on the high north that was as hidden as it was powerful. At first light, the camp came alive. Diesel generators rumbled, and technicians checked instruments buried in the snow. Snowcats and tracked vehicles rumbled in the distance, ferrying supplies, personnel, and the quiet weight of expectation. Engineers and scientists had been told only that they were building an advanced research station. But some knew more. They were tunneling deep into the ice, inch by grinding inch, with the goal of creating a network of tunnels and chambers large enough to support troops, equipment, and, in the deepest vaults, nuclear-powered reactors. This was Project Iceworm, the audacious plan to build a secret underground nuclear city beneath the ice, capable of housing missile launch systems that could strike the Soviet Union from polar latitudes with minimal warning. Beneath the frozen surface, Eisenhower's vision was that a labyrinth of ice-stable corridors would keep America's most powerful deterrents safe from prying eyes and hostile attack. The concept had captivated top brass in Washington. Envisioned were long corridors stretching for miles, living quarters deep under the ice, and, most critical of all, nuclear-powered infrastructure that would generate heat and electricity for the whole complex. The Arctic strategic advantage was clear on maps and in classified briefings. Close proximity to the Soviet heartland made Greenland an ideal launch platform, but the political cost of openly building missile bases on foreign soil was too high. Denmark, a NATO ally, was determined to maintain its official neutrality regarding nuclear weapons, so the project was approved quietly, hidden beneath layers of classification and euphemistic code names. By June of 1959, Camp Century had already begun to take physical shape above the tunnels. From outside, it looked like an oddly quaint outpost of prefabricated buildings connected by snow-packed corridors. Inside, diesel and nuclear engineers worked side by side, assembling the first prototype of what would become a subterranean marvel. Drills bored into the ice, and in time the tunnels grew long enough for tracked vehicles to rumble inside, carrying everything from scientific instruments to barrels of fuel. The air was cold, dry, and thin, a constant reminder that the world above was as hostile as it was still. Below the surface, a different kind of struggle unfolded. Ice, even thousands of feet thick, was not static. It flowed, creaked, and groaned like some subterranean creature in motion. Engineers had believed that the ice sheet would behave like stable rock. In practice, the tunnels began to shift and deform almost as soon as they were built. Steel arches and wooden supports groaned under pressure. Some corridors narrowed, others cracked. It was a battle of wills between human ambition and the relentless force of nature. Yet for those early weeks and months, that struggle was lived in fragments. The hiss of steam heaters trying to keep instruments at operating temperatures, the constant scrape of boots on frost, and the snatches of conversation among soldiers who joked about the eerie silence that came with living under a glacier. In moments of quiet, they spoke of home, of families on distant continents, and the surreal reality that here, in the heart of an ice sheet, they were part of something monumental, even if they did not yet know the full extent. Commanders rotated through the camp, briefed by generals who spoke in clipped, confidential tones. Rumors rippled outward like fragile ice fractures, whispers of missiles, of nuclear reactors buried deep beneath the surface, of strategic tunnel networks that could forever alter the balance of power. But for many who served at Camp Century, these were just rumors. Stories passed in hushed tones over mugs of lukewarm coffee in the dim glow of diesel lamps, far from the political capitals of Washington and Copenhagen. And yet, the gears were turning, both above and beneath the ice. The gears were turning, both above and beneath the ice. July 21, 1960. 1440. Camp Century, Greenland, Kingdom of Denmark. The reactor arrived under layers of secrecy thicker than the ice itself, transported in sections, guarded by armed personnel, and logged under deliberately vague documentation. The PM-2A nuclear reactor was the beating heart of the experiment. Officially, it was described as a power source for an Arctic research station. In reality, it was the first tangible proof that Project Iceworm had moved beyond theory and into dangerous execution. Soldiers watched in silence as engineers lowered reactor components into specially carved chambers beneath the ice. Every movement was calculated. Radiation sensors were checked obsessively. Ventilation systems were tested again and again. The margin for error was razor-thin. A nuclear malfunction in this environment would not simply be an accident. It would be an uncontainable catastrophe buried under thousands of tons of ice. Once activated, the reactor transformed Camp Century. Electric lighting replaced the dim yellow glow of diesel lamps. Heating systems stabilized internal temperatures. Machinery ran longer, stronger, and faster. For the first time, a nuclear-powered human settlement existed beneath a polar ice sheet. The men stationed there felt it immediately. The cold no longer dominated every waking moment. The hum of electricity brought an eerie sense of normalcy, as if the ice itself had been subdued. But beneath that sense of control, unease spread. As weeks passed, engineers documented changes in tunnel dimensions. Walls bowed inward, ceilings sagged, floors subtly rose and dipped. Instruments recorded constant micro-movement. The ice sheet was flowing, slowly but relentlessly like a frozen river. Calculations showed that over years, not decades, entire sections would collapse unless continuously recut and reinforced. The idea of maintaining thousands of kilometers of missile tunnels under these conditions began to strain credibility. Despite this, planning continued in Washington. Maps were drawn showing missile launch rails extending under the ice, each capable of repositioning nuclear warheads unpredictably, making Soviet detection and targeting nearly impossible. In theory, dozens, eventually hundreds, of ballistic missiles could be hidden beneath Greenland, ready to strike with minimal warning. Strategic analysts argued that this mobile underground system would render any Soviet first strike ineffective. The Arctic would become a silent executioner. What was missing from these discussions was Denmark. Danish officials were told only that the United States was operating scientific and defensive installations in Greenland under existing defense agreement. No formal authorization for nuclear deployment was requested. No consent was given. The political calculation was deliberate. Informing Denmark risked resistance, public outrage, and international scrutiny. Silence, Eisenhower's advisors believed, was safer. At Camp Century, the men felt the strain of that secrecy. Mail was censored. Conversations were monitored. Photography was restricted. Even casual remarks were discouraged. Isolation amplified tension. There were no trees, no horizon lines, just endless white above and compressed corridors below. Time blurred. Days were measured by work cycles, not sunlight. Psychologically, the environment gnawed at them. Some soldiers reported vivid dreams of the ice collapsing. Others developed insomnia, haunted by the creaks and groans that echoed through the tunnels at night. Sounds like distant thunder or something breathing. Engineers dismissed these fears publicly, but privately they logged increasing maintenance demands just to keep corridors passable. Then came the leaks. Not water, but heat. The reactor's warmth accelerated ice deformation in nearby sections. Supports had to be repositioned constantly. Some tunnels became unusable within months. Entire sections were abandoned and sealed off, entombed by the shifting ice. What was supposed to be a permanent strategic installation was already fighting for basic survival. By late 1960, classified reports began to circulate within the Pentagon. The ice sheet was not the stable platform they had promised the president. The cost projections ballooned. The manpower required to maintain Iceworm-scale infrastructure would be immense. The vision of a hidden nuclear city began to crack under the weight of reality. Still, no public acknowledgement was made. Camp Century remained operational. The reactor stayed online. Waste, radioactive and otherwise, was buried in trenches carved into the ice, under the assumption that Greenland's frozen cap would preserve it indefinitely. It was an assumption that would later haunt generations far removed from the men who made it. And as the Cold War intensified, the question grew louder in closed rooms and classified memos. How long could this secret survive? And what would happen when the ice finally told the truth? January 12, 1961, so I was 6:55, Camp Century, Greenland, Kingdom of Denmark. The Arctic winter pressed down with brutal indifference. Outside, temperatures plunged far below freezing, and the sun had not risen for weeks. Inside the ice, Camp Century felt increasingly alive and increasingly unstable. Maintenance crews worked in rotating shifts, chipping away deformed walls, re-leveling floors, reinforcing supports that bent under silent pressure. Every action was reactive now. The ice dictated the rhythm. Reports sent to Washington became more urgent. Structural integrity charts showed accelerating deformation rates. Sections that had been excavated months earlier were already unusable. Engineers warned that scaling this system to support missile deployment would require constant excavation, essentially chasing a moving target beneath the ice sheet. The dream of permanence was dissolving. At the same time, political power was shifting. Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency was entering its final days. The incoming administration would inherit a Cold War strategy built on secrets, and Iceworm was among the most dangerous. In briefings, generals framed the project as technically challenging but strategically revolutionary. Privately, doubts multiplied. Inside Camp Century, the men felt those doubts without ever reading the reports. The sounds grew louder. Ice cracked unpredictably, echoing down corridors like distant explosions. At night, some soldiers lay awake, counting the seconds between creaks, wondering whether the ceiling would hold. Others clung to routine, inspections, drills, paperwork, because routine was the only thing standing between order and panic. The reactor continued to run. Its presence was paradoxical. It was proof of American technological dominance, yet also a reminder of vulnerability. Radiation levels were monitored constantly. Emergency shutdown drills were rehearsed with grim precision. Everyone understood that evacuation in the event of a nuclear incident would be slow, chaotic, and likely deadly. There were no helicopters on standby beneath the ice. There was only ice, tunnels, and time, or the lack of it. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts reassessed Soviet capabilities. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were improving faster than anticipated. Satellite reconnaissance was evolving. The strategic advantage of Arctic-based launch systems began to erode. What once seemed like an untouchable position now risked becoming obsolete before it was ever completed. Still, the official stance remained unchanged. Camp Century was described as a research facility. Project Iceworm remained classified at the highest levels. Danish authorities continued to receive sanitized reports, carefully worded to avoid any mention of nuclear deployment. The silence was intentional, institutional, and absolute. By mid-1961, internal conclusions hardened. The ice sheet was alive, moving, compressing, reshaping itself, regardless of human intention. No amount of engineering could freeze it in place. To sustain a missile network beneath Greenland would require infinite maintenance, infinite funding, and infinite secrecy. None of those were realistic. Decisions were made quietly. Funding priorities shifted. Missile programs elsewhere gained momentum. The language in classified documents softened, from deployment to evaluation, from strategic installation to experimental feasibility. Project Iceworm was not cancelled, at least not on paper. It was allowed to wither. At Camp Century, signs appeared gradually. Personnel rotations slowed. Equipment deliveries became less frequent. Some tunnels were no longer repaired when they collapsed. They were simply sealed and forgotten. The base shrank inward, retreating from the ice that refused to be mastered. Waste continued to be buried. Radioactive material, fuel residue, contaminated water, all entombed under the assumption that the ice would remain frozen forever. No long-term recovery plan existed. The future was not part of the calculation. Only the present secrecy mattered. And above the ice, far from the tunnels and the reactor's hum, the world moved on. unaware that beneath Greenland a nuclear experiment was being quietly abandoned, leaving behind consequences that would not reveal themselves for decades. August 3, 1962, 11:20, Camp Century, Greenland, Kingdom of Denmark. The decision was no longer theoretical. It moved through the tunnels in silence, carried not by announcements, but by absence. Machinery once scheduled to arrive never came. Requests for reinforcement materials were denied or delayed indefinitely. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. Camp Century was no longer a priority. Inside the ice, the base felt older than its years. Corridors narrowed as pressure reshaped their walls. Doors jammed. Support beams bowed and had to be cut free and replaced, only to bend again weeks later. Engineers documented everything with clinical detachment, fully aware that these reports would likely be archived, classified, and forgotten. The reactor remained operational, but its future was under quiet review. Running a nuclear reactor beneath a shifting ice sheet had crossed from bold experimentation into calculated risk. Emergency evacuation models showed grim outcomes. If a serious incident occurred, there would be no rapid extraction, no clean containment. The ice that once promised concealment now threatened entrapment. By late summer, strategic doctrine had evolved. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles offered mobility and survivability without the political and geological complications of Greenland. The Arctic no longer needed to be hollowed out. Iceworm's original purpose was being replaced by steel hulls moving silently through dark oceans, yet nothing was formally shut down. Camp Century continued to function, scaled back but alive. A reduced crew maintained essential systems. Data continued to flow to Washington. Officially, the base still served scientific goals: glaciology, Arctic construction methods, cold weather logistics. Unofficially, it had become an embarrassment too sensitive to acknowledge. The men stationed there sensed it. Morale declined. Conversations shifted from ambition to endurance. They spoke less of missions and more of countdowns, days until rotation, weeks until transfer. The psychological weight of isolation deepened. The ice pressed inward not just physically but mentally. Then came the dismantling. The reactor shutdown process began quietly. Fuel elements were removed and prepared for transport. Systems that once symbolized technological triumph were now liabilities to be minimized. Some contaminated materials were extracted. Others were deemed safer to leave behind. Trenches were dug deeper. Waste was sealed under layers of snow and ice, marked on maps few would ever see. The underlying assumption remained unchanged. Greenland's ice sheet was permanent, frozen, inert, eternal. What was buried would stay buried. In Washington, the project's language changed one final time. Camp Century was no longer discussed as a stepping stone to deployment, but as a lesson learned. Project Iceworm faded into obscurity, referenced only in highly restricted documents. There was no press release, no acknowledgement of error. Silence again was the chosen solution. By 1963, most personnel had rotated out. The tunnels grew quieter. Sections collapsed without repair. Nature reclaimed what had been carved from it. Snow filled entrances. Wind erased surface markers. The Arctic began to close the wound. Denmark remained officially uninformed. No public admission was made that nuclear infrastructure had existed beneath its territory without consent. No international discussion took place about the waste left behind. The Cold War moved on to new frontiers, leaving Greenland behind as a frozen footnote. But beneath the ice, nothing truly disappeared. The reactor's legacy remained embedded in the glacier. Steel, concrete, radioactive material, all locked into slow motion with the ice itself, drifting millimeter by millimeter toward an uncertain future. And as the decades passed, that future drew closer. April 15, 1997, Aero 9:30, Copenhagen, Kingdom of Denmark. The silence finally broke, not with an explosion or a collapse of ice, but with paper. Declassified documents surfaced, revealing what had been buried for decades beneath Greenland's ice sheet. Danish officials, historians, and scientists read through reports that described nuclear reactors, missile concepts, and waste disposal, all conducted without Denmark's informed consent. What had once been a strategic secret was now a political reckoning. The revelations reframed Camp Century and Project Iceworm. What had been presented publicly as Arctic research was exposed as a component of nuclear war planning. Denmark, long assured that nuclear weapons would not be stationed on its territory, now faced evidence that its sovereignty had been quietly bypassed during the height of the Cold War. Scientific assessments followed quickly. Glaciologists warned that the assumption of permanent ice was no longer valid. Climate data showed that the Greenland ice sheet was not static. As temperatures rose, the buried remnants of Camp Century, including radioactive waste, diesel fuel, and contaminated materials, could eventually be released into the environment. What had once been sealed by cold was now vulnerable to time. The ethical implications extended beyond Denmark. Project Iceworm became a case study in Cold War decision-making, where urgency eclipsed consent, and technological ambition outran environmental understanding. Eisenhower's approval, made under the pressure of nuclear standoff, was re-examined not as an act of aggression, but as a reflection of an era governed by fear and secrecy. For the men who had served at Camp Century, the disclosures were unsettling. Many learned for the first time the true scope of the project they had supported. The strange noises in the ice, the relentless maintenance, the buried waste, all of it now fit into a larger narrative that had been deliberately withheld from them. Greenland itself remained quiet, its surface betraying nothing of what lay beneath. Yet beneath the ice, the remnants of the nuclear city continued their slow journey, carried by the glacier's movement toward eventual exposure. The Cold War had ended, but its consequences were still traveling through time. Today, Project Iceworm stands as a reminder that wars are not confined to battlefields. Some are fought in planning rooms, in classified memos, and beneath landscapes assumed to be eternal. Decisions made in secrecy can outlast the conflicts that justified them. The ice did not forget. It preserved everything: the steel, the radiation, the silence, waiting patiently for the moment when history would resurface. And when it does, it will not ask for permission.